talking about the border then and now. Two gentlemen who know whereof they speak, both former INS officials. That's what we used to call ICE before all the reorganization, Immigration's Naturalization Service, as opposed to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. But I digress. Let me bring them on via Skype. We say good morning to Hipolito Acosta, former District Director, Office of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. In addition, Paulie served as a Border Patrol agent as well, and a gentleman who has joined us repeatedly, and we welcome him back, Michael Cutler, who worked so hard for the INS and came to testify to me one day in Congress post 9/11. So, gentlemen, we welcome you back. And Michael, it's so good to have you. And Paulie, we're glad to have you Skyping in from Houston this morning as well. Michael,
thank you so much. It's
great to have you. Michael, since you call New York home, let's start with a quote from a New York Republican. My old colleague, Congressman Peter King, says this, and I quote, "The Obama White House should put Ted Cruz on the payroll. If he wants to come over and run for speaker, that's fine. But otherwise, he should stay over there in the Senate." Sounds like Peter's nerves are a little frayed about bicameral consultation among conservatives who are concerned about this border bill. Michael, give me your take on what is transpiring in the here and now.
Well, the here and now, and I was just on a radio show where I said that a camel is a horse designed by a committee. It ain't pretty and smells worse. I think that's what's happening here. But if you look at all of these bills, they sound good, and then you get to the fine print. And I remember going through that bill last night, and they're talking about 5 years from now, whether or not the border will be secure, and they want to have a 90% secure rate at high traffic areas. Well, this is like a school crossing guard. If you want to jaywalk, you go to the corner where there's no school crossing guard. There's nothing about really securing the border. We keep creating illusions of security, but it doesn't square with reality. You mentioned the Reagan administration, the amnesty. It was interesting because by enforcing laws against employers who intentionally hire illegal aliens, they quadrupled the workload, maybe more, yet they didn't hire a single new agent. We have about 6,000 or 7,000 ICE agents, more than half of whom are doing customs work. Put it in perspective, New York has about 35,000 to 40,000 cops. One quick analogy. There's a crackdown on people who text and drive. I am sure there are many more Americans who have driver's licenses and cell phones. You'll never hear a politician say, gee whiz, there's too many people who might be violating that law, so we can't enforce it. Yet how many members of Congress from both sides of the aisle will tell us there's too many illegal aliens here, so we shouldn't even think about trying to deport anybody? Yeah, I mean, this is crazy.
That specious argument that enforcement, well, we just can't do it, and opening the border is inevitable, and making accommodations, it's curious. Paulie, you're on the ground down there in the border state of Texas, checking in from Houston. I would be interested on your perspective of the situation now compared, let's say, to the immediate post-Simpson-Mazzoli era when you were on active duty.
Well, one of the things that's happening right now is that, the communication is so effective in getting back to countries like the Central American countries where we're seeing the surge right now. And whether it's a rumor, whether it's a smugglers, whether it's just a catch and release policy that we're doing once again, whatever the case might be, but we've seen the flooding of illegal aliens coming from Central America. And mind you that these are kids, by the way, that might be 8, 9, 10 years old. That are coming from Central America unaccompanied. That's not for real. What's happening is the family members in the United States are paying smugglers to smuggle those children. And like I've stated before, I know because I was the district director in Mexico City, and we saw child smuggling back then, and we're seeing it again. But when we have a catch and release policy on our borders, and by the way, the reason it's ground zero in South Texas, that's the closest point to Central America. That's what we're seeing. We saw it in 1988, and we're seeing it again, and we're seeing a lack of leadership. Back then, I was a supervisory special agent in Brownsville, Texas, and the administration set up tents and started detaining people, and guess what? The surge stopped.
Well, let's go to another part of your career. Back, if I'm not mistaken, I believe it was around 1980, maybe a little bit earlier, with the Mariel boat lift from Cuba. Of course, there was classification of those people as political refugees, even though, if memory serves, Castro was basically opening his prisons and sending people up this way. How do you compare what happened with the Mariel boat lift, Paulie, with what's happening right now?
Well, you might recall that President Carter made the statement, anybody that wants to leave Cuba, I will welcome with open arms. And Fidel Castro, as you well know, has long been dictating immigration policy as far as Cubans are concerned for the United States. And he said, fine, I'll empty the prisons. And I know because I processed thousands of people up at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, where I was the assistant officer in charge. And we ended up with 125,000 people on the shores of Florida. And by the way, when Senator Cruz talks about the issues with this administration, historically we haven't learned anything, because since 1964, any Cuban that enters the country illegally is allowed to stay.
And go ahead, finish your thought.
So we need to get our leaders to do what's right, not the political sound bites from both parties, by the way.
Yeah, Paulie, you're putting your finger on it, and I've long said what happens in Washington, people in both parties view this as a political problem to be managed rather than as an invasion to be stopped. Now, Michael, Paulie mentioned, we take a look at the policy toward Cuba and political exile status. There's a movement made now, or an argument being made, that these, quote, children from Central America, the Pew Report tells us 80% of them are teenage males between 14 and 18. But be that as it may, the Central Americans, the illegals coming now, really should be classified as refugees because they are fleeing violence. There's no declared war there, but they're trying to change the language. Michael, what happens if suddenly refugee status is granted these illegals?
It's a terrible precedent, because the idea of political asylum is that you're supposed to have a well-founded fear, credible fear, that because of your race, religion, ethnicity, tribal affiliation, so forth, you're being discriminated against and face persecution. Crime rates are not supposed to be a part of that. In fact, the House Judiciary Committee in December had a hearing about how members of the Mexican drug cartels, incredibly, have been granted political asylum in the United States. The parallel, by the way, with Cuba is a very good one. In fact, the last significant arrest I made was an individual wanted for murder one in Chicago, leader of a drug gang. We grabbed him here in New York City. So the idea that we're simply going to take people who say, well, it's a dangerous place where I live, would probably qualify people from all over the world. It stops becoming political asylum, starts becoming economic or crime asylum. Who wouldn't we then be in the position to have to admit it's a dangerous position? And by the way, when you talked about the Pew Report, another concern, how many of these so-called youngsters are members of the various gangs, MS-13 and so forth? As an agent, I was with the Drug Task Force for half of my 30-year career. Many of the people that we found involved with the drug trade and gangs were people under the age of 20. So we're bringing people here who may well pose a threat to American children, and ironically, children of the same ethnicity living within the immigrant communities who become intimidated and recruited into joining these violent drug gangs.
About a minute and a half remains. Paulie, I'm interested in your perspective, not only then and now, but is there anything we are missing in this whole debate and give and take? When you see the coverage of the story, when you hear the sound bites from leaders of Congress, when you hear from the president and his administration, what is your pet peeve? What are we missing now, Paulie, in this debate?
It's actually very simple. This is not a humanitarian crisis at the border, JD. It's an immigration opportunity, and the administration needs to learn that, because historically we've had this before. We need to learn from our prior experiences, and we can take care of it. I ran operations, and when I was a director in Mexico City, we stopped the flow before it ever got to our borders. We extended the security of our borders. And my question is, why are we not doing that now? We need to stop the political soundbites. We need to stop the governor from Texas, trying to launch his presidential campaign and say, this is what we need to do. We need to secure our border. And Mike made a very important point. We've added 23,000 Border Patrol agents to the security of our border, but we have no interior enforcement. So we have a magnet that people have been here illegally. And by the way, we went from 3 million in 2000 to 11.7 right now. what happened in between.
And by
Jobs
some
were being
estimates,
offered.
there may be as many as 30 million.
Yeah.
Paulie Acosta, Michael Cutler, we thank you both for your time and your insights. We'll have you back real soon. So you heard from guys right there in the fight a few years back. Your take on the immigration crisis. Tweet us your comments at Newsmax TV, #America's Forum.